The desert looked dead, but it was holding its breath. A flat and merciless expanse of scorched earth in southern al-Rashid province, where even the wind seemed hostile. A place where sandstorms could skin steel and erase entire columns. And yet what came that day was not carried by the sky, but by engines, fire, and men who had trained their whole lives for the moment. History would finally collide with them, because this was not just another advance, not just another line on a map. This was the moment two armored worlds were about to meet head-on, and everyone sensed it before the first round was fired. Captain Daniel Harker dropped inside his turret as the first sabot rounds tore across the horizon, explosions blooming like violent flowers in the distance. And through his commander's sight, he saw something he hadn't expected to feel at all: respect. Because the enemy wasn't running. They were standing, and standing meant dying. Ahead of him, the Iron Spear Regiment of the Western Coalition was driving straight toward the Lion of Al-Qadim Division, the pride of the regime's elite guard. Men raised on the belief that a soldier's highest duty was to hold the line long enough for the nation behind him to survive, even if it cost everything. This was the clash that would later be named the Battle of Black Meridian, a remote stretch of featureless desert where compasses failed, landmarks didn't exist, and survival depended on machines, training, and decisions made in seconds. And many who fought there would later say it felt like the last true tank battle of a dying era. It began on February 24th, 1991, when coalition armor rolled north from the Pale Frontier, crossing an invisible line that separated waiting from war. Their mission brutally simple: break the invader, reclaim the stolen land, and end it fast. But the road to that moment began years earlier, after the long and bleeding war to the east had left President Karim al-Sadiq with a massive army and a shattered economy, a weapon with no target and a nation drowning in debt. And when leaders like that run out of options, they don't negotiate, they take. And the small, oil-rich state of Barkan became the answer to his desperation. In 36 hours it was overrun, armor rolling through the capital while the world watched. And when the United Nations demanded withdrawal, al-Sadiq refused, convinced he understood his enemy better than they understood themselves. He believed the coalition was soft, casualty-averse, haunted by old wars. And if he could bleed them badly enough, slowly enough, they would break first. So he buried his regular divisions deep along the frontier like bait, and held back his true strength: 8 elite guard divisions, 1,000 tanks, and men trained to counterattack when the enemy was exhausted and exposed. It was the only plan he had, and under any other circumstances, it might have worked, because west of his defenses lay nothing. No roads, no hills, no references, just endless desert where even his own units had gotten lost and vanished during exercises, and he was certain no modern army could maneuver there at speed. What he didn't know, what would decide everything, was that a quiet revolution had already begun above the clouds, a network of satellites turning chaos into coordinates, making the empty desert navigable for the first time in history. And while al-Sadiq watched the frontier, the coalition was already moving far to the west, unseen, unchallenged, preparing to strike where no one was supposed to exist. At 1300 hours, 7th Coalition Corps breached the sand line. Engines roaring across the border as a psychological operations unit blasted ancient war music into the empty air. A strange, almost surreal soundtrack to an invasion that met no resistance. And for a moment it felt wrong, too easy, as if the war had missed them entirely. But seasoned officers knew better, because silence in war is never empty. It's a pause, and somewhere ahead, beyond the dust and the false calm, the Lion of Al-Qadim was waiting. And when the desert did not resist them at first. It simply watched. And the first enemy they met were not warriors from propaganda posters, but tired men in dusty uniforms who had already lost the war in their minds. Scattered reconnaissance teams who fired a few nervous rounds and then disappeared behind white cloths raised in shaking hands. Soldiers who had been pulled from villages and factories during the long Eastern War and never allowed to return. Men who had grown old in uniform and young in hope. And when the massive coalition armored columns rolled toward them, steel monsters grinding across the sand, they fired because they were ordered to, and surrendered because they wanted to live. Major Lucas Hartman watched it happen again and again. Tiny al-Rashid patrols firing blindly into the dust, coalition gunners responding with overwhelming force, and moments later lines of prisoners stumbling forward, hands raised, eyes empty, relieved more than afraid. And this was the pattern of the first day of the Great Western Sweep. Not heroic charges, not last stands, but a slow collapse of men who had already been defeated by years of exhaustion and lies. Yet the Iron Spear Corps did not race ahead like the armored legends of history. No thunderous Patton-style dash, no reckless Rommel-style gamble, because this was a new kind of war where caution ruled everything. Commanders halting their formations again and again, measuring progress by grid lines on satellite maps, moving east by invisible coordinates instead of instinct, turning one of the largest armored thrusts in history into something that felt painfully slow. Tank crews cursed inside their steel beasts, engines capable of sprinting across the desert at terrifying speed, while orders forced them to crawl, advance a few kilometers, stop, wait, confirm, repeat. And officers like Hartman felt the ghost of old commanders looking over their shoulders, wondering where the generals who rode the front line had gone, where the men who trusted their eyes instead of screens had vanished, because no one pulled up beside his tank and asked for his judgment. No one gambled, no one improvised, and war became a grid of permissions and pauses. By the end of the second day, the quiet advantage of surprise had burned away like morning fog, and in the capital of al-Sadiq's regime, generals finally understood what was happening, realizing the Western hammer was not a feint, but a blade about to sever their army in Barkhan from the homeland forever. And for the first time, they made a decision that showed real skill, because they understood something brutal and simple. Weak units would shatter instantly, and if they wanted their main forces to escape, they had to sacrifice their best. So they drew a defensive line 90 kilometers long along the northern frontier of Barkhan, a wall of men and machines built not to win but to buy time, with 2 infantry divisions and 2 armored divisions holding the north. And in the south, directly in the path of the advancing coalition, they placed their crown jewel, the faithful Storm Division, elite, heavily armored, proud, their name meaning in the hand of destiny. Soldiers raised on stories of 8 years of blood against the Eastern Empire, convinced they had saved their nation from annihilation, convinced they were the true warriors of history. And while the coalition advanced through surrendering conscripts and empty trenches, the faithful Storm dug in, engines idling, crews loading sabot rounds, commanders promising glory, because unlike the men who had raised white flags, these soldiers believed this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when legends are written and they were ready to die to become one. Unlike the broken conscripts of the outer desert, these men believed in what they were. They wore the black berets of the Guard and carried themselves like professionals, soldiers who had survived 8 brutal years of industrial slaughter and come out convinced they were the sharp edge of the nation. Men taught that their role was not to retreat, but to absorb the blow so others could escape. And because of that, the coalition did not underestimate them for a second. Respect mixed with fear, because respect in war means you understand how much damage the other side can do before they fall. What haunted every crew was not the infantry, not the BMPs, but the iron heart of the Guard. The T-72, known among its crews as the Lion of Ishtar, a low-slung predator armed with a 125mm gun that could kill at ranges most tanks never reached, armored thick enough to shrug off older weapons, fast enough to reposition and strike again. And there were hundreds of them dug in across the Guard line, supported by waves of tracked vehicles and artillery, waiting patiently, engines silent, guns laid. Moving toward them was the coalition's Western Hammer, the Vanguard Corps, a mass of Bradleys and heavy armor led by the Titan Mark I main battle tank, a machine that looked almost obscene in its power, a 120mm cannon capable of punching through any armor on the field, wrapped in composite protection equivalent to a wall of solid steel, heavier than anything the Guard could field, and yet just as fast, built for exactly this kind of fight and nothing else. On February 25th, the two forces closed to within 14 kilometers, close enough that everyone knew tomorrow would decide everything, and before dawn on the 26th, new orders cut through the radio traffic like a knife. No more screening, no more cautious probing. The mission was simple and final. Find the Guard and destroy it. Then the desert turned against everyone, a choking wall of dust rolling in until the world shrank to 20 meters of gray blindness, the kind of visibility that would have paralyzed older armies. And for a moment, crews wondered if fate itself was intervening, because this was the enemy they had trained for years to fight, and now they could barely see their own gun barrels. But the Titans did not need eyes. They hunted with heat, thermal sights cutting through the storm, turning the battlefield into a ghostly landscape of glowing shapes and moving shadows. And as the lead troop advanced near the map line marked 73 Meridian, an invisible boundary that meant nothing to the men who were about to die on it, they slammed headfirst into a forward outpost of the faithful Storm Division, infantry armed with anti-tank weapons firing from prepared positions, the first real enemy fire of the campaign crashing into the column. Only then did the realization hit. They had been advancing parallel to a road that led straight into the Guard's defensive belt, and now the trap was springing. Orders snapped through the radios as 9 tanks rolled up abreast, guns leveled into the murk, and the commander's voice cut through the chaos, calm and precise, calling the target, the frontage, the ammunition, demanding readiness reports one by one, every loader slamming around home, every gunner fixing an aim point on heat signatures flickering inside the village ahead. For a split second, the battlefield went quiet, the kind of silence that exists only right before history changes, and then 9 main guns fired at once, the opening heartbeat of a fight that would be remembered as the last great tank battle of the century. Because at 73 Meridian, in that storm-blinded desert, steel had finally met steel, and there would be no surrender this time. One round went out first, a single marker of intent, a burning point in the haze to pin the center of the kill zone, confirmations crackling back through the net, crews steady, loaders ready, and then the command dropped and 9 main guns spoke as one. A synchronized odor that ripped the silence apart and erased the village ahead in overlapping shockwaves. And immediately the order followed to keep pushing east, deeper, faster, and that was when instinct took over. That cold tightening in the gut that every experienced commander learns to trust. The certainty that the enemy was no longer collapsing but waiting. The formation shifted on the move, heavy tanks clawing forward into a rolling wedge. Thick armor and big guns leading lighter fighting vehicles tucked in tight behind like children sheltering behind giants. And the spear was ready. As the lead tank crested the rise, the sandstorm did something unreal. As if the desert itself decided to step aside, the curtain lifting in an instant, and suddenly the battlefield was there in full clarity, raw and exposed. The enemy dug in perfectly on a reverse slope, hull down, guns laid. A textbook defense meant to rob attackers of time and distance, a tactic that would have slaughtered armies a generation earlier. But this was not that generation. Thermal sights burned through deception, fire control computers erased reaction time, and 8 enemy tanks glowed clearly in prepared positions, targets waiting to be solved. The command came fast, sharp, final, fire, sabot, and the first shot detonated with surgical violence. The shaped charge turning steel into liquid light. The tank commander hurled clear by the blast, before the secondary explosion ripped the turret free like a torn limb. The gun slewed left, another target vanished, then another. 3 kills in seconds as the lead element smashed into the edge of a minefield, explosions slamming the hull hard enough to blur vision and rattle bones, flashes erupting left and right, impossible to tell where mines ended and artillery began. And then the sight opened wider, rows upon rows of enemy armor revealed. 10, 15 tanks spread across the front, Guns swinging toward the threat, crews inside cranking by hand, racing mechanics against machines that had already outpaced them, and for the first time, there was admiration. Real admiration. Because this was not panic. This was men trying to fight back against something they did not yet understand. The mine detonated under the hull with a violence that threw the commander to the turret floor, a wall of flame washing over 70 tons of steel. The driver shouting in shock, and the answer came instantly. Brutal and calm. Keep driving, because stopping meant dying. Breaking free of the minefield, targets appeared again at close range, hesitation flickering for half a second in the gunner's voice, permission sought in the middle of hell, and the response exploded back, fire, because war does not wait for certainty. One tank died, then the next. Shots cracking across the line as the rest of the formation engaged, and to the flank, Eagle Troop was tearing through vehicles at a terrifying rate, the enemy reeling in confusion. Some crews convinced this could only be aircraft because nothing on tracks was supposed to move this fast, hit this hard, appear out of nowhere in a storm. By the time reality caught up, many never made it to their hatches, and as the wedge kept rolling forward, guns blazing, mines detonating, silhouettes burning in the dust, it became clear that this was no longer an encounter, no longer a meeting engagement. This was the moment the faithful storm had chosen to stand, and the moment history chose to break them. The order was not to slow down, but to surge, to turn mass into momentum and shock into a weapon, and the armored columns did exactly that, accelerating straight into the heart of the defense, using speed itself to fracture the enemy's sense of reality. Because no doctrine, no rehearsal, no memory of past wars had prepared the Guard for formations this large, this violent, moving toward them with such unstoppable force. It was an idea born decades earlier by the Desert Fox of the last Great War. The belief that armored warfare was not just about firepower, but about tempo, about denying the enemy the time to think, and the Titan Mark I was built for it. Its gun locked on target by a stabilizing system so precise it could kill while charging at full speed, 40, 50 kilometers an hour, bouncing across uneven ground, a 70-ton avalanche bearing down on men who had seconds to decide whether to fight or flee. That impact shattered something essential in the Guard, a psychological break that no reserve plan could repair, and within minutes the coalition was punching straight through their command post and into the armored reserve. Arranged exactly as doctrine prescribed, tanks coiled and waiting to spring into a counterattack that never came. The attackers were simply too fast. Engines on the reserve tanks were only just roaring to life when the first shots tore through them, and in one frozen instant, a coalition commander locked eyes with an enemy tank leader, saw the disbelief on his face, and fired at point-blank range. The explosion so close and violent that it was impossible to tell where the muzzle blast ended and the kill began. Molten fragments and sparks arcing back over the charging tanks as the rest of the formation piled in, annihilating the reserve in its assembly area before it could even unfold. The defense had been solid, professional, layered. Reverse slopes, mines, reserves, counterattack routes. But surprise had poisoned every calculation, and once that was lost, nothing held. Eagle Troop tore the position apart, leaving hundreds dead and more than 50 armored vehicles burning in the sand, the opening blow of a battle that was only just beginning. 8 kilometers to the north, in a world reduced to swirling dust and blind navigation, Ghost Troop advanced slowly through the storm, cut off from the thunder to the south, radios crackling with uncertainty, the sense of isolation growing with every meter. Desperate to re-establish contact, the commander pushed 2 lightly armored reconnaissance vehicles forward, fragile eyes probing into the gray nothingness ahead. And as they slowed, strange shapes began to emerge from the dust, small, scattered objects that did not belong in an empty desert. And in that moment, before anyone could name them, Ghost Troop rolled unknowingly toward the next trap, where the sand itself was about to reveal what it had been hiding all along. At first, the mind searches for safety, for friendly shapes in the chaos, convincing itself that the silhouettes ahead must belong to Eagle. that the movement in the dust is familiar, harmless, but then the desert betrays you. Men rising from the ground like ghosts, engines coughing to life, a black plume of diesel smoke clawing upward, and out of the earth itself a massive armored shape reverses free. Steel plates glinting through the haze, a titan of the enemy line pulling back from its hide, and in that instant, denial dies. Turrets begin to move, slowly at first, deliberately, and panic sharpens into clarity. The terrible question hammering through the crew: where is Eagle Troop? Because whatever this is, it is not friendly. The time is late afternoon, February 26th, and the sandstorm has torn the battlefield apart, leaving Eagle and Ghost isolated from each other. Two elements of the same spear suddenly blind and alone, and the two reconnaissance vehicles sent forward to reconnect instead crash headlong into a platoon of enemy heavy tanks. The order to pull up to cover comes too late, because the cover itself is the enemy. The small mound, revealing itself as a buried tank, its gun looming impossibly close, and realization hits with a sickening weight as the commander hauls himself up, stares down, and understands just how wrong everything has gone. Instinct takes over, hands slamming the override, swinging the cannon hard, backing away, because scouts do not duel monsters head-on. But the desert offers no escape, only more movement, more turrets, more steel waking up all around them. The missile launcher rises, locking onto a perfect target, broadside, glowing bright and unmistakable, and frustration explodes when identification falters, disbelief snapping through the radio, until thermals are cut and reality confirms what is obvious: enemy tank, and the fire command finally comes. The missile launches and fails, dropping uselessly into the sand, a heartbeat of stunned silence before the wingman's shot streaks in and detonates, obliterating a tank that was seconds from killing them. And suddenly, the truth is undeniable. They are exposed, outgunned, missiles expended, facing 8 heavy tanks at point-blank range. Orders overlap, reload drills called, covering fire promised, and the Bradley's cannon chatters in defiance, shells sparking harmlessly off thick armor. The gunner's voice tight with fear as he reports the obvious, that it's not working, that they're only angering it, and the commander knows it too, knows exactly how thin their armor is, how short their time may be, but chooses to stay, to draw fire, to buy seconds for the other vehicle, because in moments like this, survival is secondary to duty. And then salvation arrives in a flash of fire, another missile, clean and precise, striking true and ending the threat just in time. The wingman's shot tearing through the tank that had them lined up, cutting death off mid-motion. In the swirling dust and noise, life continues where it should have ended, and the lesson of the desert is sealed in steel and fire. That victory at Black Meridian was not just about machines or doctrine or technology, but about crews holding together when the map disappeared, when orders broke down, when fear was absolute, and choosing to fight anyway. This was the last great clash of armored giants, not decided in grand strategy rooms but in seconds of confusion, courage, and instinct. And when the storm finally passed, the battlefield belonged to those who had pushed forward into the unknown and refused to stop.